Advance Wars: Days of Ruin was, as of now, the final installment to the series, and a very unique one as well. Advance Wars started as essentially a battle simulator. It never took itself too seriously, there were always instances of humor thrown into it. It wasn't really until the Game Boy Advance, with those games, the series also got a story-based campaign, a little bit more in-depth. The characters always took themselves very lightly, especially in those games. They were very young, they were even children at times, they had extremely emotional reactions to the action, so we would have tanks shooting at the infantry, and then the tanks would knock out the infantry, and then the commander commanding the tanks, he would show very happy emotions, and on the other side, the infantry commander would be very sad, very strong, extreme emotions. The actual loss of life that was happening right there, it wasn't really acknowledged. They never really acknowledged that people died and stuff. And, honestly, that's what's great about the old Advance Wars. It took itself very lightly, not seriously at all. It was just a fun game, and that's exactly how it should be. It's quite unique to see that kind of a game, especially in a turn-based tactics game. In that kind of a medium, you don't usually see it so often. Now, with Days of Ruin, on the other hand, they took a complete 180 turn in that regard. They completely changed that theme, that relations. So just to start with, the setting is completely different. Now it takes place in a post-apocalyptic setting. It's very badly damaged by a meteor strike that knocked out a huge portion of humanity. So the general tone, the look of the game, it's quite literally dark. It actually is dark, so... and most of the setting is like that. Even when it's a lighter setting, it's also much darker compared to how it was in the previous game. So when I say that it's dark, I mean that it's literally dark. But other than that, everything else has changed quite a lot. The art style is slightly more realistic, it's more serious in tone. It's still cartoonish, not completely serious, but it's not very colorful anime style as it was in earlier Advance Wars game. Everything is changed in this game. All the old factions are thrown out, all the old characters are thrown out. They took a big risk with this, because when you have a sequel to an old series, you have that emotional attachment to the characters that you can carry on to the next game. In this game, this was lost. They have to start all over, which I sort of, in one way I applauded that they took a risk and went in a new way, but on the other side, me as well as all the other gamers, when you're a big fan of a series, you are attached to the characters, and in a way you also feel sad that they don't come back. Now, one thing that remains are the teams. So the red team sort of represents the US military style, and the blue team sort of represents the Soviet-Russian military. But besides that, all of the references are completely lost. There is some criticism regarding this new dark look, and I suppose to some extent it's a matter of personal taste, but the main criticism, and I agree with it quite a lot, is that the darker look itself, it doesn't actually make a game more serious because of it. Just because it's darker, maybe you're just trying to target it to teenagers, to smaller children, to make it look more quote-unquote edgy and stuff. But just because of that, content-wise, even if you added some blood, the game doesn't have blood, but if you did, that wouldn't make it more mature just by itself. Now, the deeper question is, does the game reflect its darkness within the content and the gameplay? Now, for the gameplay itself, not really. It mostly stays the same. It doesn't really reflect the more serious tone. Units are still completely considered disposable. The characters aren't really taken seriously. They don't really acknowledge the loss of life that much. You're not being forced to keep your units alive. You can still sacrifice infantry to save another unit, and it's never considered a dilemma at that time. And honestly, for me, this is completely fine, because any tweaks to that formula would have completely changed the gameplay. That's why the serious tone itself, the tone itself doesn't show itself in the gameplay, but more in the story. So the main theme, maybe how would I say it? The part that I like most is how the characters react to the situation that they find themselves in. Because the story itself isn't necessarily incredibly innovative. Yeah, my English, I know. Isn't, the story itself isn't anything that special, but what is pretty well done within the story is the reaction of the characters to the humans. Maybe the characters as themselves, how they're written. Because, like, look at, for example, right now, as of writing the script, we are in the middle of a pandemic crisis, and, like, looking at the real world around us, you can see that the crisis, it's going to bring out very heartwarming cooperation. On one side, people are going to help themselves, work together, but on the other side, you're also going to see some very strong war profiteering and greed on the other side. It can be seen to some extent by individuals and also by corporations, but let's leave it here and go back to the video games. I would say that, the story does a good job of reflecting this humanity in a completely fictional scenario. Just, if we sum up the story, it follows our main character, Will. He's basically picked up by a surviving battalion that's acting on its own. It's a remain of old army. He finds his place within there, and he continues to fight them. They fight different enemies. At first they fight some bandits who are looting and spreading anarchy, just taking advantage of the crisis. The bandit commander is given some minimum story, but in general he's a pretty flat character. He doesn't, I don't know, I suppose he has a motive for raiding as he's low on supplies and he needs medicine badly, but it's fairly flat, I suppose. But I suppose that is unexpected to find people like that in a post-apocalyptic scenario. So after that portion, the war breaks out between the two factions that were two main countries before the meteor strike. And the interesting thing is that our main characters actually find themselves on the side with the bad guys, but they do change sides eventually, though. Maybe the thing that I sort of dislike most is the ultimate bad guys. So the ultimate bad guy is a weird scientist guy. He creates his own military. He has clones as his servants. I don't know, I suppose it's interesting that the game goes into the topic of human cloning and questions whether they have less of a value compared to a human. So even one of our main characters finds herself to be a clone in the later portion of the game, and she has to go through small of an existential crisis. Now, of course, the clones were also presented in earlier games, in Dual Strike, but it was a very small portion of the game. One clone sort of questioned his existence and wondered about his original model, or how should I say, person he was cloned after, but that's a very short moment. That clone perishes very quickly. Days of Ruin sort of expanded on this. It's interesting that they went into this. This topic is definitely something that awaits us in the future. There's also an odd illness that's spreading around. At first it also affects only children, but later everyone. So again, mostly the interesting thing is about how characters react to the threat. It's not that the illness itself is in particularly fascinating. One odd mission actually deals with a cult where people are infected and they're being fooled into believing that they're worshipping a bug who can save them. So it's quite odd, but the false prophet will actually bring out an interesting argument. He says that by giving them a reason, he's giving them hope, a reason to go on, and because of that he's helping them, which is definitely an interesting thing. And I suppose to some extent you even can't argue with him, so it's interesting to think about it. One of the bad guys, I suppose, Admiral Greyfield on the other side. He reacts with complete panic. He's going to shoot any of the infected people. He's going to hoard all their medicine for himself, and of course that policy turns out to be completely disastrous because everyone is hiding their illness. Is very fastly spreading through the ranks, and even Greyfield himself finds himself infected very fast. And because of that, he finds himself in a situation that he can't escape. As I wanted to say before, the main villain, Dr. Calder, he's probably the weakest part of the plot. It's just a weird scientist guy. At first he's doing stuff from behind the curtain, making other characters fight between themselves, and then later we find him to be the true enemy, and he's the guy that we fight. That's all fine and good, but he's a very two-dimensional character. He doesn't really have a special motivation, I suppose. He doesn't really have a special reason, special character development. However, I do have to admit that the scenarios that are created around him, they do make an interesting scenarios where where the better written characters are given their time to shine, how they're going to react to it, and of course the focus is on the gameplay. It's always been on the gameplay. There's no point that I'm over analyzing it here. It's a turn-based tactics game, and that has to be the main part of the game. There is no way around it. In general, I'm a big fan of the campaign. I like the stories, I like the scenarios. My biggest complaint is definitely that you can't choose your own commander, so you're just stuck with whoever the game assigns. You also can't maybe pick your strategy around the commander that you use. Unfortunately, for most of the time, you're stuck with your main character, Will. Even though he's the main protagonist, he's a relatively bland character. He's sort of a goody-goody type of guy. I mean, the game definitely revolves around him, the story is his hero's journey, but I would prefer a character who's not complete goody-goody, maybe a little bit more realistic. But I suppose for a tactics games, it goes good enough. But as far as the gameplay goes, I really can't do anything but to criticize it. I can't really say anything but to praise it. In general, it's a huge improvement compared to the Dual Strike. The biggest difference that they did is that commander powers are now significantly weaker. So no more of the overpowered super commander powers with Dual Strike double turns, which are just completely incredible, just completely overpowered. So it's one of the biggest downsides, because some of those are completely broken. This game is a lot more balanced. It's even so balanced that it's playable for multiplayer, and they even had a multiplayer mode at the time, which is also pretty cool. Also, some of the old units were removed and some new ones added. This adds a new nice breath of fresh air. The game is very smooth, it plays wonderfully. For example, a new unit, Anti-Tank. It's an indirect unit, it can counter-attack. It's a new unit, it's changes the gameplay a little bit, it's great. We have the motorbike units, they're fast, they allow you to take cities faster, they make the game a little bit more dynamic. Units can also now level up, they can gain offensive and defensive bonus, which is great. It makes them slightly less expendable, so that's great. All around, it's a bunch of tweaks that make the game a lot better. So the general formula is left alone. That's about it. So that's the final installment. Pretty cool, but it's been 12 years now since this game came out. So the big question is, what now? Where's the new Advance Wars? We had a new console, 3DS, come out, but nothing yet, and Nintendo Switch and the Wii U, and we didn't have a spin-off game like it was on the Wii, so how come? Hard to say. I definitely hope that the series makes a comeback in the near future. Looking forward to it.